Project Zomboid is an amazing game, which is easily shown for the hundreds of hours I've spent playing it. Few games can come close to replicating the experience that Project Zomboid provides, and a lot of that comes from the massive amount of effort the developers put into the game. With its massive map, tons of weapons, unique tone, and different character builds, Project Zomboid clearly stands out from its competition. One of the best things about Project Zomboid is its skill system, and the large variety of skills you can grind up, from stealth, to long blunt, to cooking, to metalworking. Every single skill provides something unique and fun to the player. Well, almost every single skill. There is one skill in Project Zomboid that is almost useless. A skill so confusing that the community had to go into the game's code to try and figure out what it even does. And that skill is first aid. Before I move on with this video, I have to, as always, make a few disclaimers. First of all, this game is in early access, and so my criticisms might not apply by the time the game releases. Second of all, as I'm going throughout this video, whenever I say the word infection, I'm talking about regular infections that we get in real life, and not, the disease that causes people to turn into zombies in Project Zomboid. So yeah. So how does the medical system work in Project Zomboid? Well, it can be roughly divided between injuries and illnesses. Injuries will always occur in specific parts of your character's body, like their arms, their necks, or anywhere else. These injuries will range from a small scratch, to a broken bone, to maybe even a bite. This is where we begin to see the first major problem in Project Zomboid's medical system, that being the lack of treatment options when it comes to injuries. There are only 3 ways you'll ever treat an injury. Either you'll bandage it, sew it together, or you'll put a splint on it. That's it, and considering how rare it is to get a broken bone in Project Zomboid, or even a deep wound by that matter, 99% of injuries can be solved just by slapping a bandage on them. This is, for obvious reasons, pretty uninteresting. The wound infections you can get in-game don't help either. Since these infections are so mild, you can literally just ignore them and wait until they go away. By the way, remember when I said that deep wounds and broken bones are rare injuries you get in Project Zomboid? Well, that kind of applies to every single injury in this game, with only one exception. Realistically speaking, there are 5 ways to get injured in this game: falling from a great height, crashing a car, getting set on fire, and being hit by another player. Thing is, it's pretty easy to avoid all these injuries. You can just not jump out of buildings, you can just drive slower or better, you can just be more careful around fires, and you can just play in single player. In short, unless you're a new player, chances are you'll never get any of these injuries from these actions, and the only time you'll ever get an injury is from that 5th option I talked about. That being zombies. In Project Zomboid, there are 3 types of injuries you can get from zombies: scratches, lacerations, and bites. All of these injuries are treated just by slapping a bandage on them and waiting until they heal. But here's where we begin to see another major problem with the medical system in Project Zomboid. You see, whenever you get scratched, lacerated, or bit by a zombie, there's a percentage chance of you getting infected by the zombie virus, which, by the way, cannot be cured or prevented in any way. So, as a reminder, the vast majority of injuries in this game will only come from zombies. Those injuries can be treated perfectly just by slapping a bandage on them, even if you literally have no skill in first aid whatsoever. And those injuries can infect you with the zombie virus, which there is no treatment for, and first aid cannot help with. This is bad. If the point was to make an interesting medical system that the player feels like it's worth to invest in, this is clearly a failure. When almost every single injury can be solved by an illiterate idiot with a single ripped sheet, it completely invalidates any use the medical system could have had. And what's worse is that the illnesses in Project Zomboid don't really make things any better, because they don't exist. The only time you'll ever get sick is if you eat some food that's gone bad, drink unfiltered water, or if you become soaking wet and catch a cold. And that is not how colds work whatsoever. Oh, and by the way, you can't treat these illnesses. No, I'm not kidding. There is no way to treat these illnesses. The only way you can do anything about it is if you forage from herbs in a forest and get lucky enough to get the ones that you need. And so, if 99% of injuries can be cured just by slapping a bandage on them, and every single illness can not only be completely avoided, but can't even really be treated, then what is the point of the first aid skill and the medical system as a whole? Because as far as I can tell, there is no point. It's basically useless. You can remove the first aid skill entirely, and the game would quite literally not change. So, the medical system is in desperate need of an upgrade, and I've got a few suggestions. The biggest change I would make would be to completely overhaul the infection system in Project Zomboid. As I've said before, currently infections in Project Zomboid basically don't have any effect whatsoever. In this new overhaul, infections would be a lot more dangerous and complex than before though. They would also be a lot more common, because let's be honest here, zombies wouldn't exactly be hygienic, and so whenever you get scratched with them, a lot of foreign contaminants would be introduced to your body. Infections would be divided between common infections and uncommon infections. Common infections are meant to represent the common bacterial infections that people can get from their wounds in real life. These infections will be divided into two different groups, positive infections and negative infections. Both types of infections will start off being painful to the player, and depending on how they progress, will begin to give the player fevers, nausea, extreme pain, and even death in the worst cases. These infections could be treated using wide-spectrum antibiotics, but here's where things become interesting. In the game, there would also be specific antibiotic drugs that could treat the infections much better than the normal wide-spectrum antibiotics can. The issue is, these antibiotics would only work on one type of infection, so positive antibiotics would only help out with positive infections and so on. But how's the player meant to know if they have a positive infection or a negative one? Well, they can just use a gram staining kit, where the player could take a blood sample and test it out to see what infection they have. The ability to use such kits would probably be locked behind a magazine or an occupation, and these kits would spawn in pharmacies or hospitals, since these gram staining kits are pretty common in these areas. But what about uncommon infections? Uncommon infections, unlike common ones, represent specific diseases and conditions we deal with in real life. These infections would be by design quite rare, since their effects on the player would be very severe to the point they would be debilitating. Uncommon infections would be split into three different types: anthrax, celiacis, and necrotizing fasciitis. All these infections would be extremely severe and would likely cause death to the player if they aren't treated properly. The player would still be able to use wide-spectrum antibiotics to try to treat the infection, but these would likely be ineffective, requiring the player to find and use specific antibiotics. Unlike last time though, gram staining wouldn't work, and instead the player would have to use blood cultures. Now, without going into the intricacies of manual blood cultures and how they work, there would really only be two ways to identify these diseases. The first would be to use an API strip. These strips are a thing we have in real life and are a way to quickly identify infections easily. These strips would be quite easy to use, and so a player would realistically only need to read a magazine in order to use it. If the player didn't have access to an API strip though, then they would only have one other option: manual blood cultures. In my version of the game, only doctors would be able to use this option. How it works is pretty simple. The player would just need a bottle of clean water and a blood sample. From there, they could just create a new blood culture and wait a couple days to find out what kind of infection they have. That's it. In case you're wondering, yes, this is how it actually does work in real life. You can just make a blood culture with just a bottle of water and a blood sample. But for obvious reasons, we don't tend to use this blood culturing technique nowadays anymore. So, yeah. There you go. Common and uncommon infections explained. But I still have a lot of suggestions I want to make before I can come even close to ending this video. First of all, I'd like to change how colds work, by removing it entirely. There isn't any real way to get a cold in the zombie apocalypse, and making it so it just comes from your character being wet is just kind of ridiculous. I do understand the developers want there to be some sort of effect on the player for being soaked to hell, which is why I'll just make it so the more soaked your character is, the slower your movement speed and attack speed are. Because that's just how that kind of works. Soaked clothing seriously slows you down. The next thing I'll change is how untreated water works. Currently, drinking untreated water just kills your character, which doesn't really make any sense. Instead, I'll make it so that every single time your character drinks untreated water, there would be a chance it would get infected, with that chance changing depending where that water came from. So drinking from a puddle would have a much higher chance of being sick than a fast-moving river would. If your character got sick, it would actually work a lot like common infections, where you could just take regular antibiotics, but if you want it to be more effective, then you'd have to use a gram staining test. The third thing I would change is how stitches work. As it currently stands, some rando on the street can stitch a wound up perfectly well. But in this new update, I'll make it so the quality of your stitches would change depending on your first aid level, with the lowest level being absolutely horrible, but by level 2, your stitches would be pretty good. I would also make it so then stitches would break depending on how much pressure you're putting on them. So, if you have stitches in your leg and your character's just running all over the place, they would have a good chance of their stitches breaking. That chance would be higher the lower the quality of their stitches are, and if they do break, those stitches have a chance at getting infected, just like in real life. The The last major thing I would change is how traits work in this new medical system. A lot of traits in Project Zomboid are either free points or, well, a waste of points. But this update would change that. Traits like smoker, overweight, underweight, slow healer, and sickly would suddenly actually have negative effects on the chances and severities of infections. And traits like resilient would actually become useful. Hell, the team could even add in a trait like immunocompromised, which would make it so that a single scratch could kill your character instantly, even if that scratch didn't come from a zombie. I could go on for hours about the different changes I want to make to the medical system for Project Zomboid, but instead of doing that, I'm going to put this list up on the screen. Read it if you want. Okay. So, yeah. I hope that throughout this video I've been able to show you how the medical system for Project Zomboid is flawed and how it could be, better. I know that for some people, my suggestions are a little bit too complicated and, might be a bit too complex for a new player to get used to. To that, I say, have you seen the mechanics skill on Project Zomboid? Because my god, is mechanics complicated. Look, maybe this isn't what the developers want out of Project Zomboid, and if that's the case, then that's perfectly fair. I just really wanted to make my suggestions known because, well, I really, really, really like this game a lot, and so I wanted to see it in the best place it can be. Regardless if my suggestions are actually good or not, I hope that at the very least this video was interesting or at least amusing to anyone who's watching this right now. So, yeah. I'm gonna head out now. Hope you have a good day. See ya.